And joining us now on the debate, Susan Eng, Vice President of Advocacy at CARP. That's an organization representing people who are 50 plus. I guess that's you, that's me, that's probably it at this table here. Okay, there's Radcliffe Dockery. He is with Higher Eye Training and Consulting. Krishna Sadavanamutu, he's with the Canadian Federation of Students and the National Council of Canadian Tamils. Josipa Petrunic, University of Toronto, postdoctoral student and federal candidate for the Liberal Party in Calgary East. Talk about a tough mission. Oh my goodness, okay. And a reminder, everybody, first of all, thanks for being here. A reminder, we call Thursday's broadcast Your Agenda because we want you involved. Our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog, that's tvo.org/theagenda, or on our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/theagenda. Send us a tweet as well if you like, twitter.com, #YourAgenda. Jump in, join the debate. We'll get your comments up on the screen throughout the broadcast, as we do on Thursdays. Okay, let's get into this. We just shone a bit of a spotlight on the Sikh community, and we're going to look at some other communities as well. Radcliffe, yeah. Jamaican Canadians, are they adequately involved in the political process in your view?
No.
How come?
A couple of reasons. First would be the history where a lot of Jamaicans are coming from. In Jamaica, the history of Jamaica's politics is PNP, JLP, and it's very, very divisive.
PNP and JLP means what?
People's National Party, Jamaican Labor Rights. Well, Labor Rights is a bit right of center, PNP is a bit left of center, and it's very hot political. So if you walk in this wrong area of Jamaica with a JLP sign, we saw in the 80s, it could lead to your death. So a lot of Jamaicans came up here in my parents' generation and said, I want nothing to do with politics when I come up here. But they have political opinions. If you want to see a debate, get a JLP and a PNP in a room, they'll debate something from 1967 that happened at 8:30 p.m. and they both remember it. So that's—
Which one are you?
I'm neither, because I'm born and raised here. So I watch my mom and dad who are both JMP, and I watch them sometimes, it's really funny. But I think the second part would be our generation, the generation Xers, when we were raised, we were told, you know what, we came to Canada with nothing, so your job is to go to school, get an education, and get a good job, because we came here starting from nothing. It's just not to see some of the Jamaicans and the black community overall get involved in politics. But again, we have a lot of political opinions, but we don't translate to necessarily getting involved into the political system.
We're going to explore more as we go through this discussion about how to maybe change that. Krishna, this past federal election, May the 2nd, saw, I think to many people's surprises, the election of the first ever Tamil Member of Parliament in Scarborough. Your community has been so politically active for so long, I think people were surprised that you never had a Tamil MP before this. How come?
Well, I think it was a natural culmination of many, years of political activism here in this country. As you know, there was a civil war that had torn apart the island of Sri Lanka, with the minority Tamils being persecuted, being denied fundamental rights like education. And so when the Tamil community came here in large numbers, they decided that it was important to get an education here, to have a community that was strong and stable, and to be represented in all walks of life.
But not necessarily to run in winnable ridings.
Well, I think it was a long time coming, and I do think that it reflects not only the priorities of the community, but also perhaps some shifting priorities of political parties in our country to be more inclusive.
Okay. Josipa, as I pointed out earlier, you ran for the Grits in Calgary, which is kind of hostile territory. But during the course of that, I gather it gave you some insight into how Sudanese Canadians are connected or not to the political system in this country. What's happening in that community?
Well, I think in that community, actually, it's a rather interesting phenomenon because, in fact, I have to disagree with what you said earlier on in the program, that, perhaps it is the case that people are simply choosing this as not the conduit, so Canadian politics is not the conduit for achieving their goals. But in fact, that's simply not the case with the Sudanese population. The argument that I would make, actually, in looking at that community is that they tried. They tried desperately, actually, to use the Canadian political system to help them, but their primary goals were actually the improvement and the amelioration of democracy back home. And when they hit the wall and were rebuffed repeatedly, I think what you now see in this most recent election is a stepping back and a refusal, more or less, to get involved at the deepest levels of politics, because there really is a sense that Canadian politics hasn't served them. And so what you've actually seen there is a level of apathy that's been generated and created artificially, because this is a population that's deeply political. It's very savvy. It's politically involved in terms of its own home democratic renewal in the south of Sudan. And this is a country that's going to be declared independent on July 9th. So you've got a lot of politically active individuals, and they've got the groundwork as well. They've got structure. They've got a liberation movement, 15 organizations across the country, huge population in Calgary that's extremely well organized, and they've got the resources. And yet, as I say, they've been rebuffed at repeated points in the last 10 years in terms of getting the Canadian government to recognize not only what's going on in the Sudan, but to actively get involved in the Sudan. So because of that rebuffing and because of hitting that wall, I think what you're seeing is a constructed apathy now. And that's unfortunate because now it's the second generation. So it's not just the first generation people who would have come over. That would have been 10 years ago. Now you have their children who are in high school, and unfortunately we're now creating the culture of apathy that we all bemoan.
More to unpack there as we go along. Susan, here's what I want to talk to you about. We all remember Game 7, Vancouver versus Boston, and Vancouver then went a little nutty after that. And in the aftermath of all of that, one of the fascinating things that never got mentioned is that the first non-white police chief in this country was running the show in Vancouver, and no one mentioned it.
Exactly.
What did you think of that?
Well, you know, I woke up to the fact that Chief Jim Chu was the police chief just about a year and a bit ago. And I thought, why didn't somebody tell me? Right? Because it was something that that happened, and certainly in the area.
You didn't know?
No,
you didn't know Vancouver had an Asian Canadian?
Not until, no, I tripped over it in news reports. You would have thought that at the time that he became chief, there would have been a big hoo-ha about that. Because remember, policing was one of those areas where it's very difficult to have any level of diversity. There have been some tortured relationships with visible minority groups, all of those issues. And when the first police chief of Asian descent, ascended to a major city, I thought, maybe somebody might have told me, but I think that's a good thing.
And it didn't get mentioned.
Yes, I think we need to look forward to the time when somebody hits high office, reaches high office, that no one mentions what their race or background is, and we're not there yet. We're still obsessing about it. We're worried about it, and I guess we need to ask ourselves, why do we care so much? Are we saying that the people who are holding those positions now cannot represent us, that they represent the stereotypes or the discrimination that we worry about, that we are the only people who can defend our rights and insist on our interests? I like to think not. I think that it is important to have a broader perspective.
Well, you say we're not there yet, but we were there. We were there the night of Game 7. No one mentioned the fact that this guy's Asian Canadian.
Yes, and I think we have to celebrate that, but we were too busy being unhappy about them wrecking the city over a hockey game, please. I mean, that's what we have to start talking about. But I think that in the halls of power, in the corridors of power, where I spend a lot of my time now advocating, it is a fairly unrepresentative group of people in terms of their backgrounds.
I think the numbers are, wait a sec, the country's what, 16% visible minority, Parliament's about 9.5%.
Exactly.
So not quite representative.
We're doing very poorly on women too, 50% women and 25% in Parliament, and we're celebrating that because we've got to celebrate something. But I think that as we walk the corridors of power, we have to ask ourselves, are the interests that we're raising important enough, and are they finding traction among the critical mass of those people who are occupying those seats? And I would say that it takes a bit of work in order to get their attention, but once you do, it isn't too bad. Now, where I think we have a bit of a fulcrum right now is, on one hand, you're getting these broader issues into the corridors of power, but sometimes, and I worry about this part, the parliamentarians pick up on some threads in the community that suit their political ideology, and then they exploit that.
Well, let me follow up on that with Radcliffe.
For our country.
It was 26 years ago we got our first Jamaican-Canadian cabinet minister in the province of Ontario, Alvin Curling. Right. So this is a door that's been knocked down a long time ago. Why haven't more people walked through it since then?
Well, it goes back to I talk about the apathy, with the same thing within some of the Jamaican and black community overall. Mr. Curlin won an election, and he's one of my mentors, by the way. And when you talk to Mr. Curlin, he talks about how hard it was to get the black people to come out and support him. And I think remember, he won an area of Scarborough, and he built up a rep. After the second or third election, he was guaranteed to keep winning. Like, he built such a great machine. But what's happened since then is, first of all, I think when we say the Jamaican community or black community, we have to be careful even with that statement. Because a lot of blacks, I grew up in in Jane and Finch area or Rexdale. We migrated to Mississauga. Then some migrated to Ajax, some migrated to Thornhill, and then some, not all of us are Jamaican, to a lot of people's surprise. Some of us are from Guyana or Trinidad or other places. So what you have there that, the issues that might have mattered to me at Rexdale, they still matter to me because I still advocate for a lot of youth issues, etc. But I'm in Mississauga paying property taxes. I'm asking my city councilor, what are you going to do about my property taxes? Where someone in at-risk neighborhood may be more concerned about the issue of, how come you haven't updated my housing project yet? Or how come, so that's part of the issue. I think that in the Jamaican community in particular, in the Black community, we don't have straight talk within our own community. So when we come out, there's 5 different voices, that say 18 different things. We don't have a solid voice that says, here are maybe 3 to 5 core issues, and now let's deal with them. And that leads to a problem.
Well, I wonder, Josip, that there are the communities on the one hand, but then there are the people who sort of have the keys to those doors. Are they as welcoming as they ought to be in getting people from more diverse backgrounds into public life?
Well, I'll give you a case study from the Sudanese community, certainly. I mean, if you take a look at what happened to the Sudanese community in Calgary East, which is where a number of them are located as a cohort, back in 2005, when there was negotiation over a peace agreement, a lot of Sudanese in that community felt that this was now their conduit towards Canadian politics. In fact, a number of individuals in that community felt that they were going to run, either provincially or federally, because they saw that the government, up until then, the Canadian government had gotten engaged there. After the peace agreement, it's like the Canadian government just dropped off the radar screen. So it's pretty much accepted knowledge that Canadian government has done very little in the Sudan in the last 6 years. As a result of that, what we saw was actually a number of the diaspora community not run for election in Canada, but go back to the Sudan, where they are now ministers and running for election as parliamentarians in the south of Sudan. So what we did lose was actually a generation of potentially activated Sudanese parliamentarians. And we lost that because, as Government of Canada, as our parliamentarians, we engaged in tokenism. So after the peace agreement, I would say from 2006 to about now, what's happened is the Sudanese community is called up when elections come around. In between elections, you'd be hard-pressed to find any kind of engagement at the federal or provincial levels with that community.
Are you still a student at York University?
Yes, I am,
you
actually.
You are? Okay. Yep. How old are you?
I'm 25.
25. Oh, then you're way older than half a dozen parliamentarians already, right? There's a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds in there.
I guess so.
But do you find that the outreach from the parties to, to students or to younger people to get involved in public life, particularly from diverse backgrounds, is it there or is it not there?
I think, again, it's coming. The parties certainly are making strides to reach out to quote-unquote ethnic communities, racialized communities. But I do believe that sometimes perception itself is as important as reality. If we look at, for instance, how many cabinet ministers in Stephen Harper's government are from, ethnic communities, there's only a very small handful. If you look here provincially at Dalton McGuinty's cabinet, or even if you look at parliamentary assistants, a very small handful of them are from racialized communities. And so it creates the perception to people from these communities that perhaps politics is not the space for them. And because this perception is created, sometimes these communities, for instance, in my community, we are more likely to get involved within our own communities. An example of that would be the organization I'm involved with called the National Council of Canadian Tamils. It was formed very soon after the 2009 protests, after the war in Sri Lanka had come to an end. And it was a body that was democratically established with representation at the national, provincial, and regional levels all across this country. And we saw about 30,000 members of our community vote in the election to form the council.
That group is influential, but it's not decisive. It doesn't make decisions like politicians do.
Of course not, but the point I'm trying to make is that I think that because this perception sometimes exists that politics is not the space for community members from racialized backgrounds, they feel more comfortable operating within their own grassroots communities.
Well, Susan, try this on for size then. You say politics, Krishna, but let's be more specific. Maybe elective politics is a place where many people of diverse backgrounds don't feel comfortable. There are volunteer jobs, there are campaign staff jobs, there are lobbying jobs, there are a number of different jobs besides putting your name on a ballot.
Well,
are people involved there?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's where many communities have their greatest work, have done their greatest work. For example, for a period of time, I was working on the head tax redress campaign. All volunteers, all at the computers in the middle of the night. And we had a great deal of impact politically. We got a historic parliamentary apology, for example, and that's in the records now. So there is a lot of ways for people to actually participate in the political process that is changing our current public policy or our laws through public protest, public campaigning. However, I think it still matters whether or not you're sitting in the halls in the corridors of power. I'll give you an example. We went to, I and some 300 older Canadians, Chinese Canadians, went to Parliament to watch the Prime Minister give the apology. And I looked around the room as we were getting ready and waiting for the apology. And there were about 300 older Chinese Canadians looking around in their halls of power, never having been there before, ever. You could tell. And then the Prime Minister stood up, gave the apology, and then said a few words in Chinese. And the place just about erupted.
Remind us, which Prime Minister?
This would be Prime Minister Harper.
Okay.
Now, during the election campaign, this is interesting. The Liberal Party always felt that they had the lock on the votes of immigrants, especially Chinese immigrants, but they refused to give the parliamentary apology. So we threw it open during the campaign. We said, okay, the first party that bends over and picks up this political gift and just says, I will give the parliamentary apology, is going to get our endorsement.
Yeah. Is that the way it worked out?
That's the way it worked out.
Huh. Radcliffe?
It's a great point because there's 2 points to that. The first point you made about, we have to have issues that people care about in the halls of power. So an example would be, I serve on the board of the Canadian South African Chamber of Commerce. And when I was in South Africa, when I came off the plane, black South Africans did not believe I was from Canada. I said, why? They said, because no black man from Canada ever comes here. It's only whites. So when I went to the halls of power and I met my MP at the time, and I said, how can we do so much trade with a country and no one looks like them who goes there? It's absolutely ridiculous. And because of that, we're starting to make some traction on that issue.
So they've rectified that.
Yeah.
They've started to.
Well, very slowly, but at least they're returning my calls. But on the second point about the Liberal Party, and we have to say this, in the black community, you would think the Liberal Party was led by Nelson Mandela. And you would think Trudeau was Nelson Mandela himself. You ask many blacks why you vote Liberal, because of Pierre Trudeau. As if Bill Davis was not the premier at the time and had all the immigrants who were here. As if Diefenbaker had no immigration policy. So you have a lot of blacks who just automatically vote Liberal, and that's been to our big detriment in elections. So Jason Kenney, when he started coming around Brampton, I live in Peel region. So he started coming around a lot. I didn't see Liberals around. I didn't see Liberals talk about the fact that immigration tax that was come on board shut down immigration from the Caribbean, because we don't come from the Caribbean, a rich country. We can't come with $50,000 and get in this country. So the Liberal Party really dropped the ball big time, because what they did was take a lot of us for granted. And so I still think a lot of blacks will still vote Liberal, but I know a lot of them who switched over to Conservative simply because they said, yeah, Trudeau's gone and I respect him, but you know what? What have you done for me in the last 10 to 15 years? Right, so your issue's a point, and the issue of the black community is asking, you know what? Maybe I do care about crime issues. Maybe I do care about free trade. Maybe it's just not the same old things that Trudeau talked about in 1970s.
All right, Josip, but let me turn this into a bit of a, what was that?
I feel like I've been stabbed here, because I want to actually raise the alternative perspective, at least out west. If we're going to contextualize Canadian politics, we have to look at regional context, right? And certainly a different phenomenon was happening here in terms of Jason Kenney's approach towards ethnic communities. If you take a look at Alberta, where effectively there has been one-party state provincially and there's been one-party rule federally for the better part of the last 40 years. And you actually have the exact same phenomenon, but even worse from the conservative side towards those communities. Now, not to make it overly partisan, but if we take a look at Calgary East, for example, and here's a point on the heterogeneity of these cultural communities. I got the endorsement of the Sudanese, I got the endorsement of the Lebanese, I got the endorsement of a Vietnamese association. It didn't translate into votes necessarily, because what you have is a low level of voter participation, right?
And the leadership can't deliver
and
those
the leadership
votes.
is not necessarily representative. So our assumption when we talk about accessing ethnic communities, and I have to take Jason Kenney to task on this, who are you actually accessing? You're accessing, and here's a critical and I think controversial point, you're accessing very often a group of self-declared male leaders within a community. Okay, and that we have to be fair about that. These are heterogeneous communities. If you point out the leaders, and even if you look at our foreign aid missions abroad, who do we actually access? Typically self-declared male leaders within a community. Same thing in Afghanistan, same in Sudan, same out in Alberta, right?
That is a consistent part of our history.
Right.
And in fact, it's something that always has concerned me, the gatekeepers, I call them, the political godfathers. Right. And indeed, they have in the
they
past.
Are fathers.
Well,
Not
indeed,
mothers.
they
They're
are
fathers or
fathers, although
grandfathers.
we had quite a few godmothers too. The most essential point in the Chinese community was the ability to speak English. Not only to speak English well with politicians, but to speak to the Chinese community with very highly educated language, which was also an impressive thing. So for the longest time, especially here in Toronto, there were people who delivered votes of the community to the politicians. And it's still happening. I'm not saying it's not happening. It's just that as we move through our the history of our political engagement, we as communities have to evolve, and they are definitely not homogeneous. But we allow the politicians to treat us that way.
Josip,
that the similarity on skin color is enough to grab their attention.
I mean, your point is apropos, and I'm actually going to add an even further note. I mean, again, looking at the context of Calgarian politics and Albertan politics, there's also a culture of fear there. And so when you go around to the communities, I know I'm Croatian. Did I get a huge slew of Croatian support? No, I didn't. Okay, I have certain liberal views that don't necessarily resonate with the whole of the community. It's a heterogeneous community. But why did I not get a huge amount of Croatian support? I didn't get a huge amount of Croatian support because according to a lot of the members in the Croatian community there, the fear is that funding will be lost for the cultural center. Okay, so when you have a state like Alberta, or you have the kind of politics of conservative rule in Alberta as you do, or any one party for that amount of time, the sense is that as you're getting money for a cultural center from a particular government, if I show allegiance to any other particular party, even if you take my photo and it shows up on your website, I'm worried we will lose funding for this cultural center. And that is a very real concern. And that is the same with the Sunnis who don't have a cultural center, who want one, and who are now negotiating where do we put our allegiances in the hopes of actually getting one. And it goes to even the more pragmatic. In a place like Calgary where campaigns they're under-campaigned, right? These areas are under-campaigned. You go door to door, and initially when some signs went up on lots, I thought, okay, that individual's a conservative, fair enough, I'll go to the next door. Until a former city councillor said to me, actually, you know what, Josipa, go and knock on the door because anyone who says the person doesn't speak English and is too afraid to take down the sign. They never asked to put the sign up. Sure enough, we went door to door. A number of the signs on those lots were actually not put there because the homeowner wanted it. It's actually because, for whatever reason, the opposing team felt it was their right to put them on the lot.
I've also heard that the man of the house said yes to the sign,
Absolutely.
But don't forget about the woman of the house.
And this was my last point. There's a gender divide in these communities, a massive gender divide, not just in terms of who the leadership are, but when you go door to door and you try to engage politically, and you're facing a cultural situation where it is the husband that's going to declare how the politics are going to unfold, then you've already cut out half the population, and a very vulnerable population. And unfortunately, in cultural communities where ESL may be the issue, or where women's rights are the issue, we are certainly facing that.
Krishna, let me follow up with you on this. Again, on the male-female thing. There are communities, we don't have to name them here, I think we know what a lot of them are, that are more patriarchal than matriarchal, let's put it that way. Is that an issue when it comes to trying to get more female names on a ballot to run for Parliament, to run for Queen's Park, that kind of thing?
Of course. I think in society in general, there's that patriarchal kind of problem that exists here in Canada, and it certainly exists within racialized communities. It exists within my community. My community traditionally has had some very conservative, almost stereotypical views about women getting involved politically, women being involved with civic engagement. But I do think, again, with this new younger generation that's rising up, that those boundaries are starting to be broken.
And it's a Tamil woman who became the first Tamil MP in Canadian history.
That's right.
What did the community think about that?
I think the community was extremely excited at this new prospect. Finally, we have a voice, a quote-unquote voice that will represent us within the Tamil community. And I think for a lot of young people, specifically Tamil women, they saw this as something that they can now do. That glass ceiling has been broken, and now this is an opportunity that they can also pursue.
There's two parts to this, though. One is running, and then running in a winnable riding.
Yes.
Lots of people run. But you often have to run in the worst seats where you got no hope. Mind you, the last election kind of proved that there's no such thing as no hope anymore.
Exactly, and there's also a challenge too.
Yeah, that's true.
When you ask a Tamil woman now to represent and be a credit to her race and to her community, and that is actually, that starts to become an almost impossible task, because you can't win all the time.
Alvin Curling talked about that, you know?
Yes, all the time.
26 years ago, he talked about showing up at events with a massive headache because he felt the weight of an entire...
And he's still bothered today. I mean, not bothered, but I mean, sometimes it is bothersome. You go to some black events, Gina Augustine, who's our federal, you know.
First black female MP.
That's right, Gina Augustine. No, we love her. Alvin Curlin, Mr. Braithwaite, right? Senator Oliver. But they're invited to everything. and so it goes to 11 o'clock at night, you're looking at them saying, I feel sorry for Brother Alvin. Okay, he's been there all night. So that's an issue. I think as well, too, within a lot of cultural groups, it's the issue of the generation gap is huge.
But there's also a problem once they get into a party, whether or not they have any real influence, or if they just served their role being a token. You know, now they look good in the photograph.
There is a lot of that.
You know,
yes,
and who's sitting behind the prime minister in the photographs in Parliament? They move them around so that
you see that as well.
You see that a lot now. Is that the only role they serve? Do they have any real role?
What's the answer to that?
I think they're challenged to carry on that role. I think that they have to work twice as hard. They, you know, so many of the times, I think they get the feedback of, well, look, we made you a member, so, you know, be happy with that. There is a lot of that. And what's more, we've got one of you already, so we're not going to try any harder to have more and not have any critical mass. We don't want you to bunch up, right? So it's that kind of thing. It is, you know, even after you get there, there's an onerous responsibility for you. And I think that is asking a lot of people.
Is there a Croatian representative in Parliament right now?
There is. There's Lynn Jelic.
Lynn Jelic?
Yeah, that's right.
Where's she from?
I think her writing is black strap, I think. I can't actually remember
Alberta.
the exact. No. I think it's Ontario, actually. You'd have to correct me on that.
Gosh.
I'm pretty sure. But and actually, I mean, I wanted to add a point to this, though. We're assuming that to some degree, once they get into Parliament, that these are naive individuals. They certainly are not naive individuals. I mean, the case that comes to my mind, and when we talk about ethnic minorities, we think about obvious visible minorities, but what about less visible minorities and linguistic minorities? I mean, Bev Oda, here's a great case of somebody who I think probably felt the weight of who she was supposed to be representing and how the Tories were using her as a token representation. And when everything...
What, Japanese Canadians?
Well, yeah, I think so. And I think that's pretty clear, right? And I think Bev probably felt a very heavy weight of not wanting to overstep the line and certainly not push the envelope on certain issues. And yet, when push came to shove, she almost had to in order to be a proper minister. And so we see there, I think, the difficulty that these individuals get into when they have to sort of say, thank you so much for putting me in this position in order to represent this community, and almost obsequiously having to enslave themselves to an upper level power. But these are not naive individuals. So,
no,
you know, would I say...
Party discipline is pretty odious. And I've actually, you know, I do in my work in advocacy, I go up to any MP and I say to him or her, and I say, I think you need to do this for us. Right? And I find, unfortunately, that when I look at a person who's there, not part of the majority, is not going to say, oh yes, let me carry your banner. They say, let me check, right?
Who do they need to check with?
Well, I'm not sure, but I know that they're not going to say, oh yes, I can make that happen. And there is that, even though in their non-political lives, they might have been king of the road, but once they're inside that party discipline, there's a hierarchy that grows up and it's hard to break through. And I feel, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm overly sensitive, that they really do have that double burden. On one hand, they are just one MP among many. On the other hand, I think they're carrying the weight of either not overstepping, not getting outside the characterization of being a token. And if they push on equality rights, for example, that, oh, well, of course you would say that, you know, that kind of thing. So I think that they do carry that all the time.
I wonder if there's two levels here as well, Josipa, which is there are some invisible minorities in this country, and I guess they can get away with not having to represent particular communities. But Susan, if you ever get elected to Parliament, you know...
God forbid.
you really can't run away from who people think you're supposed to be representing,
right? It doesn't wash off, does it?
Right, that's one way to put it. Or I guess you'd be in the same boat there, wouldn't you, Radcliffe?
Oh, most definitely. And you know, you look at it, you know, how to make these issues relevant to the halls of power. And I think one thing we have to look at is what's happening in Canada right now. So, so when you do a lot of your events, it's about healthcare is the #1 issue in the upcoming election. Who's going to pay for this? It's going to be the next generation. Well, the next generation represents, I guess stats can't show, for every 100 people leaving the workforce who are white, 75 are going to enter. For every visible minority is going to leave, every 100 is going to leave, 142 are going to enter the workforce. So visible minorities, or in Peel region we call them, we call them majorities, because we're the majority in Peel region now. So if we're facing economic issues, the income disparity issues. Who's going to pay for healthcare? Who's going to pay for education? More importantly, as the U.S. continues this downward spiral, who is going to help us trade with the countries we need to trade with?
Let me come full circle then here.
Yeah.
We started this program with you saying that Jamaican Canadians were really disproportionately underrepresented in the halls of power for a whole bunch of reasons you pointed out. They're just, you know, you could die in Jamaica if you didn't pick the right team or you found yourself in the wrong spot. What are we going to do about this?
Well, number one has to be the people who can lead and who can. Forums like this are very important. No, there are a bunch of people on my Facebook of Jamaican black backgrounds who are watching this right now, are probably tweeting saying "Gode rad," as they would say in Jamaican culture.
They say what?
Gode, which means go there, you go rad, right? Or they say Gode, so we'll say in Jamaican culture, right? So, I mean, when we talk about issues, when you have a forum on healthcare, when you have a forum on education, on finance, having people from different backgrounds who represent advocacy for those issues is important.
But be more specific. How are you going to get more Jamaican Canadians to run for office?
Well, the first thing is go deal with the ones who have some activism. You had Samuel on here, who's Ethiopian. You've had Mark Beckles on here, who's Bayesian. Yes. Yeah. You've had Mark Beckles on here, who ran in the last election. Right. You've had Mark Warner on here. Yeah. We have a group of people who want to run, who have run, and should run. So we surround them and we get them educated. So we work with the Susans, who have some experience in advocacy. We work together with different groups.
Okay, let's get over here. Go ahead, and then.
Well, I was going to say there's some pretty practical moves, actually. If you take a look at, again, I'll speak to my riding. One of the first things I did was say, let's go to the high schools. I mean, with all due respect, does the whole of Canada watch this program? No. So even if every single night you had a minority on this program, it wouldn't necessarily change things. You go to the high schools. And yet in the high schools, the most vulnerable high schools, the places where the most number of Sudanese students are, they don't want you. And we were talking about this earlier on. These are the most vulnerable high schools, the places where most socioeconomically depressed. And the families are begging you to go to the schools and talk to their children.
They don't want you because?
Principals don't want you, administrators don't want you, politics is dirty, let's not talk about it here. And then the patriarchy of it, okay? So getting into schools where I had a connection was no problem. Getting into the school right down the street, where a huge number of Sudanese, Vietnamese youth, Chinese youth were youth at risk, which the city police have already identified as youth at risk. Getting into those schools, the automatic response from the principal was, this is not what these kids need. So what do these kids need? Wow. What these kids need is to get politicized at grade 10, absolutely. So what we're doing is at the administrative level, from a paternalistic standpoint, saying we know what's best for these vulnerable youth. What's best is showing them the conduit to political power, because it's these youth that need that political power.
Krishna.
Well, I think this issue can't be siloed to one specific community or to specific individuals who may have been able to overcome these obstacles that we see in our society. I think what's really important here is to recognize that, for sure, according to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, everyone has the right to participate in political life. Everyone has the right to run for public office. But there is a difference between formal rights and substantive rights. And when we start looking at substantive rights, where we consider the socioeconomic challenges that prohibit certain people from enjoying those rights, then I think we start answering the real problems here, and we start looking at the real problems.
Am I being incredibly naive to say, but anybody can run, right? You can't automatically win, but anybody can run.
I think this election proves your point. In the past, it was always said, you know, the visible minority or token gets thrown into a riding, he or she cannot win, right? Don't bother. Or you don't have a history, don't have the connections, you don't have the team, you don't know how to fundraise, you don't know how to check the list, you don't know how to get elected, right? And everybody said, well, there are too many barriers, I'm not going to start. The lesson to take away from this election is take a risk, it could happen for you. Because there were what? Even, you know, when we're talking about liberals and conservatives, never mind the NDP in Quebec, you know, there were many, many ridings where, you know, you had Navid Bain, he shouldn't have lost, but he did in this case. And he had all the groundwork and so on, but something else happened. So things can happen. And I think if nothing else, after this election, I think that there's an opportunity for people to just put their hat in the ring. They might get there, and then they make something of it.
You never know. Last minute, go ahead.
Again, I think this issue can't be siloed to specific individuals or specific instances where people may decide to throw their hats into the race, because there are some real socioeconomic challenges that we need to start addressing as a society so that people can then put their hats into the race and have a real chance of winning. For instance, one of the issues in our society is that racialized communities are 2 to 4 times higher, have poverty rates that are higher than the average population here in Canada.
If you're poor, you can't run.
If you're poor, you can't run. If you're facing pay inequities, where are you going to find the time to run?
And then lastly, the challenge there then is to make that relevant to the people in power. So what sales 101, what motivates my customer really interests me. and we have to get to that point.
Josipa, I'm going to ask you the last question.
Yeah.
You're going to run again, right?
I am, yeah.
Why don't you pick a riding where you got a better shot at winning?
Well, you know what? Because you're basing your question on a myth that these ridings are not winnable. Calgary ridings are winnable. As a Liberal, they're under-campaigned. They're severely under-campaigned. So as long as we engage in a 4-year campaign and strategy, I mean, with all due respect to this last election, I'm not going to base my win on fluke and hope. I'm going to base it on strong ground campaigns.
Well, the party's rebuilding, so they'll need you.
Good on you. Okay, can I thank, for appearing on the program tonight, for a really good discussion, Josipa Petronich, the next member for Calgary East from the Liberal Party, U of T postdoc researcher, and Krishna Saravanamutu from the Canadian Federation of Students. Good to have both of you on that side of the table. Susan Eng from CARP and Radcliffe Dockery from Higher I on the other side of the table. Thanks so much, everybody.